In 1954, Egyptian archaeologist Kamal el-Malak was conducting routine excavations along the southern wall of the Great Pyramid of Giza when his team came across a limestone slab nearly 30 meters long, laid flat directly into the bedrock of the plateau. Beneath it, sealed in an airtight pit, was something no one expected to find beside the greatest structure the ancient world had ever built. It was a vessel. Disassembled into 1,224 individual parts, stacked in precise order, wrapped in reed matting and bound with ropes of plant fiber that had barely decomposed over 4,000 years. What struck specialists immediately was that every part had been numbered, like components in an industrial kit, complete with assembly instructions. Whoever put it there intended it to be put back together. When the pieces were reassembled, the vessel was fully functional. Every joint moved, every load-bearing element held, every fitting worked without a single structural part needing replacement. Engineers from the Cairo Polytechnic Institute, brought in for an independent technical assessment in 1957, put it in writing. The construction was designed with a precision that left nothing to chance at any level. Where exactly this vessel had sailed, and why it had been deliberately disassembled and sealed beneath the pyramid, that question was not addressed in their report. The find has an official name: Khufu's ship, or the solar boat. Egyptologists classified it as a funerary object, a vessel meant to carry the pharaoh's soul through the afterlife, and that classification shut down most of the uncomfortable questions before they were ever seriously asked. Built from Lebanese cedar, 43 meters long and nearly 6 meters wide, it survived so intact that not a single load-bearing component needed replacing during assembly. Only a few minor structural pieces had crumbled on extraction. It was the engineering, not the supposed funerary status, that made specialists stop and look more carefully. The hull is built on what is known as a sewn boat principle, held together not by nails or metal fastenings, but by a system of rope lashings threaded through specially drilled holes in the beams. When the fibers absorb water, they swell, the lashings tighten, and the entire hull becomes a single, rigid unit. This is not a workaround born of limited resources. It is an engineering principle that eliminates the need for metal entirely, one that European shipbuilders only came to recognize as a deliberate approach considerably later. The shape of the hull reinforces this. The bow and stern rise symmetrically in the form of a papyrus flower, and this is not decorative, it is functional. The shape reduces drag and stabilizes the vessel in open water. Edwin Tooze, a British naval architect who examined the boat as part of a research program in the 1980s, noted in his report that if this vessel were launched today, it would behave predictably and stably on open water. Not like a funerary prop, like a working ship. The first boat was excavated, reassembled, and placed in a purpose-built museum on the Giza Plateau, where it remains today. But just a few meters away, a second sealed pit of identical dimensions had also been found. Egyptian authorities decided against opening it immediately, partly for preservation reasons, and partly because the work on the first boat had already demonstrated just how technically demanding and risky that process could be. The second pit sat untouched for more than 30 years. In 1987, an international research team drilled a small hole through the limestone slab and lowered an endoscope inside. The camera captured wooden components. A second vessel was confirmed to exist. Chemical analysis of the air inside showed intact organic material. The pit was resealed. Full excavation didn't begin until 2011 as part of a Japanese-Egyptian collaborative project, and work is still ongoing. Components already extracted show a construction identical to the first boat. The same sewn hull system, the same overall form, the same numbered parts. The official explanation for why there were two is drawn from Egyptian cosmology: the day boat and the night boat of Ra, accompanying the sun through its celestial cycle. That interpretation is consistent with New Kingdom texts. But those texts were written roughly 1,000 years after the boats were built, and whether they reflect the meaning intended by the builders of the Old Kingdom or a meaning assigned to them later, is a question that has never been resolved. The standard dating of the boat is tied to the cartouche of Pharaoh Khufu, Cheops, found on several of the blocks that sealed the pit. This places the construction of the vessel at around 2500 BC, in the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom. But the cartouches on the covering blocks and the vessel itself are two separate objects with separate histories. The blocks could have been placed later than the boat was built. This isn't a fringe hypothesis. It's a standard problem in archaeological dating, one that is routinely considered in most contexts, but which has been consistently set aside in the case of Khufu's ship. Egyptologist John Romer, whose work on the history of the Old Kingdom spans several major publications, noted that the technical sophistication of the boat has no direct parallel among other Egyptian vessels from the same period. This doesn't mean it is older, but it does mean it either represents a peak of craftsmanship with no surviving counterparts, or reflects a tradition of knowledge we have not yet traced to a source. Radiocarbon analysis of the boat's organic materials, the ropes and wooden elements, produced dates across a wide range. Part of this is explained by the fact that Lebanese cedar is a slow-growth tree, which introduces a systematic offset into radiocarbon dating of the timber. But the full results of that analysis have never been published in a peer-reviewed journal. This is not a claim of a cover-up. It is a verifiable fact, one anyone can check by searching the academic literature for a complete published study. One of the findings recorded during the initial examination of the boat, and one that has largely disappeared from popular accounts since, is that the wooden components show clear signs of wear. Not damage, not deterioration, but the kind of wear that comes from repeated use. Friction marks on the oarlocks, wear patterns at the rope lashing points, characteristic erosion at the oar fittings. Beyond that, traces of Nile silt were found on several wooden elements. Silt accumulates on a hull through movement on the river. It cannot end up on disassembled components as the result of a one-time funeral ceremony. This boat had been on the water, more than once. This directly contradicts the standard account of an object made specifically for burial and never used. Funerary items in Egyptian tradition were typically created for a single moment, not for repeated practical use. The presence of wear and Nile silt points to a vessel with a real working history before it ended up in the pit. Where it traveled, for how long, carrying what and on whose orders, none of these questions have received answers, because none of them were treated as research priorities once the object had been categorized. Mark Lehner, one of the most respected scholars of Giza, does note the signs of use in his work and proposes that the boat may have been used during the funeral itself, to transport the pharaoh's sarcophagus along the Nile. This is consistent with written sources on burial rites, but the scale of the documented wear, not the trace of a single ceremony, but the pattern of sustained, repeated use over time, is not addressed within that explanation. The cedar used to build the boat is not Egyptian. Cedar did not grow in Egypt. It comes from Lebanon, from the mountain forests that Egyptian pharaohs had been systematically harvesting for timber since at least the 1st dynasty. Trade moved through the Phoenician port city of Byblos on the coast of what is now Lebanon, and this route is well documented in Egyptian trade records going back thousands of years. But the volume of cedar in Khufu's ship is not a few beams on a merchant vessel. It is several tons of high-grade processed timber in precise specifications, delivered from Lebanon to Giza. Reconstructing the logistics of that operation honestly requires seagoing vessels capable of carrying significant cargo along the Mediterranean coastline. Ships of a fundamentally different class from the river craft typically associated with Egyptians of this period. This is where one of the more persistent circular problems in Egyptology appears. Building Khufu's ship required ocean-capable vessels to bring the materials. Having those vessels required an established tradition of seagoing construction. The boat itself is partial evidence that such a tradition existed, but it is also the primary argument for its own existence, because direct physical remains of Egyptian seagoing ships from the early dynastic period are extremely rare. The true scale of Egyptian seafaring in the 3rd millennium BC remains a considerably more open question than it is generally treated as being. Khufu's ship is not unique. In 1991, in Abydos in Upper Egypt, an American expedition led by David O'Connor uncovered 12 wooden vessels buried near the funerary complex of First Dynasty pharaohs. These date to around 3000 BC, 500 years before Khufu's ship. Each was between 18 and 29 meters long, placing them in the same general scale. Technical analysis of the Abydos boats revealed construction methods identical to those of Khufu's ship, the same sewn hull principle, the same structural logic. This means that the tradition of building large sewn vessels in Egypt predates Khufu by at least 5 centuries and was already fully mature by the time he came to power. Where this tradition came from, how rapidly it developed, and how far back it extends, these are questions Egyptology has not answered with confidence. What is particularly striking about the Abydos find is the location. The boats were buried in the desert, far from the Nile and from any waterway. How they were transported there, along what route, using what methods of haulage and organization, these are questions that received far less attention than they warranted. The discovery was classified as ritual, and its technical and logistical dimensions were left outside the main frame of inquiry. The funerary classification of Khufu's ship was established almost immediately after the discovery, and has not been seriously revisited in any major academic work since. This is not inherently a problem. The funerary context of Egyptian royal burials is well understood, and the interpretation of the solar boat as part of a burial rite is consistent with a body of textual sources describing the pharaoh's journey aboard the celestial boat of Ra. The issue is chronological. The texts describing the religious meaning of the solar boat come from the New Kingdom, a period roughly 1,000 years removed from the construction of the vessel itself. The gap between the New Kingdom and Khufu is approximately the same as the gap between us and the Middle Ages. Applying the religious symbolism of one era to a physical object from another is a methodological choice, not a self-evident conclusion. In most academic disciplines, that choice would require explicit justification. In Egyptology, applied to Khufu's ship, it has never been debated directly enough to produce serious disagreement in the literature. This is not a charge of bad faith. It is a description of how institutional momentum works in a specific case. The classification, funerary object, was set at the moment of discovery, reinforced by subsequent scholarship, and has since functioned as a starting point, rather than a conclusion requiring ongoing scrutiny. New evidence, the silt, the scale of wear, the numbered parts, gets incorporated into the existing frame rather than being allowed to challenge it. Here is what is established and undisputed. Khufu's ship is the largest and most completely preserved wooden vessel from the ancient world. All of its mechanical joints are functional after 4,000 years in a sealed pit. It was built from Lebanese cedar, which required a major logistical operation across the Mediterranean. Its parts were numbered before disassembly. Its functional components show signs of sustained, repeated use, including traces of Nile silt. An identical second vessel was sealed alongside it. The dating, based on cartouches on the covering blocks, is indirect. Here is what has not been established. Whether the vessel was built specifically for burial or disassembled and interred after a period of active use. Where it traveled and for what purpose. Why the parts were numbered, which implies the intention to reassemble them if the vessel was meant to remain buried forever. Why the complete results of the radiocarbon analysis have not been published. And what accounts for the scale of wear that is inconsistent with a single funerary use. None of these questions are unanswerable. All of them point to an object that physically exists sits in a museum within walking distance of the pyramid and is accessible to researchers. The questions are open not because the answers are out of reach, but because at some point, people stopped asking. The Solar Boat Museum stands against the southern wall of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Inside it, resting on purpose-built supports, is a vessel 43 meters long, assembled from 1,224 pieces that are 4,000 years old. Every joint is functional. Nile silt on the hull confirms it sailed. Numbered parts confirm someone planned to reassemble it. Not one of these details has found an explanation within the framework of a purely funerary object. Here's a sentence that does not appear in any official description of this find. Khufu's ship is the only large vessel from the ancient world that was deliberately disassembled, numbered, packed, and sealed in a state of complete readiness for reassembly, and which 4,000 years later retained full structural function. No other object of comparable age satisfies all of those conditions simultaneously. That is not rhetoric. That is a technical description of what is sitting in the museum. The second pit is still being excavated. The full radiocarbon results for the first boat have still not been published. The silt and the wear are documented but unexplained. Someone, 4,000 years ago, took this vessel apart, numbered every piece, and sealed it all beneath the pyramid. Exactly the way you would store something you planned to use again.